Today, the big question is, why should you care? Who are we? What is the nature of reality? Where is our consciousness from? What is our relationship with time and space? How does it affect the purpose and the meaning of our lives? What are the approaches to divinity? These questions are important to humanity because our view of the world shapes what we do and how we live. Although the modern science and technology have provided us with a so-called better worldview and enable us to enjoy more material wealth and longer lifespans, but it is at a cost for this. Dr. Iain McGilchrist has taken on this challenge. His new book offers a new vision that is based in the science of the brain, deeply grounded in a philosophy, sustained by the most up-to-date findings of physics, a vision that inverts common assumptions about what matters, a vision that sees the whole, not the parts, a vision that helps us break out of the hole of mirrors. It tackles the fundamental questions of what we can say of time, space, motions, matter, consciousness, purpose, value, and divinity. It offers us a new perspective of humanity and the world at the fundamental level, the matter with things. In this series, we are delighted to have Dr. Iain McGilchrist with us today. He is a psychiatrist, neuroscience researcher, philosopher, and a literary scholar. He is a former fellow of Royal College, Oxford, and an associate fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a former consultant psychiatrist and a clinical director at the Bethlem Royal and the Maudsley Hospital, London. He is the author of a number of books, but is best known for The Master and his Emissary.
Hello, Iain. Welcome to the Clubhouse.
Hello, Ivy. Thank you very much for that introduction. I wonder how much of it we can talk about, but let's give it a good go. Well, I mean, first I should say, so as not to put off too many people, that the last couple of 100 pages are references and an index, or a couple of indexes. But it is a long book in 2 volumes, and it's because I wanted to address the fundamental questions. When I reflected on the Master and his Emissary and what it was talking about, namely the way in which the 2 brain hemispheres not as was traditionally thought, do different things, but are involved in everything, certainly, but in a completely different way. So they produce, by paying attention to the world differently, they produce 2 quite different visions of the world. So the question then arises, if they are not always consonant with one another, and they're not, they often have rather opposite features, which of these 2 should we prefer? And you might say, well, how would we know? Because we're inside the brain. We've got only these 2 ways to go on. But nonetheless, of course, our experience is synthesized from the 2. And I wanted to examine, first of all, which one is more reliable, which one gives us a more consistently, a vision of the world that answers to our experience more consistently and is richer and explains more. And then to apply our knowledge of the difference of the 2 versions of the world the 2 hemispheres would produce to looking at these huge questions that you mentioned, such as the nature of time, space, consciousness, matter, and so on, and our values, including the sense of the sacred. And it's quite clear that each of them would have a different take on this, and it would have, as it were, predictable qualities according to the different two hemispheres. So when we look at, in the past, when philosophy or science, indeed, in the case of physics, came up with different visions, we more or less had to sort of shrug our shoulders and say, well, the evidence seems contradictory, and some people believe this, and some people believe that. But I'd like to think that I've made a small contribution to the progress of philosophy in that we can see the hallmark of the left hemisphere, the stamp of the left hemisphere, on certain repeated ways of thinking about the world and about human life over history. And we can then, if you like, be more wary of them. We can go, well, there may be some truth in this, and I don't deny that there might be some truth, but we mustn't go in for it hook, line, and sinker. We must be very careful to take into account the version of reality that we can identify as coming from the right hemisphere. And perhaps just finally, it's worth pointing out that they have different attitudes to one another's contributions, in that the right hemisphere has very broad, open, inclusive attention, and the left hemisphere has a very piecemeal, fragmentary, detail-orientated attention. And so the right hemisphere knows already that it doesn't know everything, and is therefore quite keen to incorporate what the left hemisphere can tell us. But the left hemisphere doesn't know what it is it doesn't know. It doesn't see that it's missing things. And so it believes that it can see more, that it's the master in the image of my relationship between the hemispheres, whereas in fact, it's just the emissary. Yes, the book is for purely practical reasons divided into 2 volumes because it would be unwieldy in one, but it's actually divided into 3 parts. The first part is neuroscience, the second part is epistemology, and the third part is ontology. What I mean by that is the first is the examination of this very question I've been discussing of the reliability of the 2 hemispheres. The second part is how do we get to know anything? You know, the various paths we can use to arrive at truth. And the third is, so when we apply what we've just learnt in parts 1 and 2 to our vision of the world, what does it look like? What can we believe has a better chance of being true than the rest? So part 1, I look at what I call the various portals on reality which the brain can offer. What I mean by portals is sort of immediate, more or less immediate, understanding. So the first thing is attention. I believe attention is the key to everything, and that indeed attention is a moral act because it changes the world and it also changes us. The kind of attention we pay makes a difference to who we are, but also to what we find. So it looks at attention, perception, which is not the same as attention. We can perceive without attending, and we can attend without perceiving. The judgments, the beliefs, in other words, that we come to have based on what we attend to and what we perceive, our emotional and social intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, good old-fashioned IQ, and our creativity. And I suggest that in every case, the right hemisphere is better equipped to give us a chance of understanding what it is we're looking at. In a way, we need all of these working, including creativity, because after all, we've got to, when something comes to us, it doesn't come to us with a label on it, what it is. We have to sort of, well, I see it's like that. So our understanding of things involves all those. And the right hemisphere is better at every one of them. Now, that might surprise people who say, well, what's the point of the left hemisphere? The left hemisphere is much better at one particular task, which is the ability to grab, get, and take stuff. For example, food, a twig to build a nest, whatever it is, a tool, whatever it is that we need to manipulate in order to apprehend the world is the sphere of the left hemisphere, and it's better at that. But when it comes to understanding the world, comprehending it, the right hemisphere is far better. So that's the, as it were, if you like, the payoff of part 1. Part 2, I can summarize quite quickly, really. I say, what are the main pathways whereby we can work on what it is we've learned through these portals in order to come to a better understanding? And I think most people would certainly say science must be one of them. I would. Reason must be another. Another would be intuition. And finally, although possibly more controversially, imagination. I should say here briefly that I write a lot more about this, but that in essence, I want to distinguish imagination from fantasy. Fantasy is something that takes us away from reality. Imagination is our only chance of getting into the core of what we're looking at, or in other words, to understand reality fully. So I look at all of these four, and what I show is that each of them has its strengths and each of them has its limitations. That's only natural. No one of them on its own can do everything, but each of them has a valuable contribution to make and should not be neglected. Also, that in every case, and this includes science and reason, which might surprise some people who only know the bad old pop psychology story about left and right, it's actually the right hemisphere that tells us more. So even in science and reason, and certainly in intuition and imagination. And then comes the last part of the book, part 3, which is volume 2, physically. And in that I look at, first of all, the possible structure of the universe. And by that, I mean, I look at the question of the coincidence of opposites, the nature of the one and the many, or the one and the 10,000 things in Chinese culture. And then I move on to looking at what we might call, in the Western sense, the building blocks of the cosmos. So space, time, flow, matter and consciousness, values, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. Some people might be surprised by the inclusion of the last of those, or even the last 3 of those, as elements that are irreducible in the cosmos, but I believe that I can argue that they are, and I'm not alone in philosophy in believing that.
It was beautifully written. By reading your book, I'm enlightened by it. You have a knack to explaining things really, really well. Loved it. So we're going to touch on chapter 8, creativity. Was my favorite chapter in the entire book. A year ago, I saw you with John Cleese interview you, the talk on consciousness and creativity. 2 British icons got together. Yeah, I laughed so hard that I had to rewatch it a few more times just to get the satisfaction out of it. Love the part when John said, looking at failure, mistakes, and imperfections of things with some humor. It's good old British humor, isn't it? I used to binge watch Forty Tale with my son every winter on the chapter.
Yeah.
On the chapter of creativity, could you speak a bit on the importance of creativity, and also briefly talk on the link between creativity with mental health, please?
Yes, of course. And by the way, John is not only a very, very funny man, and I believe his sense of humor is a product of his extraordinary intelligence and imagination, but he's also, of course, a very seriously philosophically interesting thinker. And when we get together, we always have a great deal of fun, but we also touch on some important topics. Yes, in the chapter on creativity, I'm looking at the contributions of the 2 hemispheres here, and I'm embarrassed to say that although almost every single thing that used to be said about the difference between the hemispheres is wrong, the one thing that is probably right was that people thought the right hemisphere was more important for creativity. I wish it wasn't, but I have to be true to the science. It is. So I can dismiss pretty much everything else that people used to believe, like the left hemisphere is down to earth and reliable, and the right hemisphere is airy-fairy and so on. It's not. The right hemisphere is much more reliable. It's much more down to earth. The left hemisphere is not unemotional. It's prone to fits of anger and aggression. So anyway, that aside, yeah, I look at this both in theoretical terms. I look at what is involved in creativity, because it's not just a single thing. It's a set of processes whereby the ground is prepared, a seed is sown, and then a flower emerges. And these are different stages of creativity, and the 2 hemispheres contribute in different ways to different degrees at different points in that process. But in short, I think it is the right hemisphere that's able to see what in philosophical and psychological terms is called a new gestalt. A gestalt is simply, it's a German word. We don't really have any equivalent in English, but it means the overall shape or form of something that cannot be reduced to its parts. And all my life, I felt that it was wrong, that the whole is just the sum of the parts. I couldn't explain why when I was young. I now can explain why, but it takes a while. Why it is that the whole is simply not reducible to the parts. In fact, in order to know what the parts are, we have to have some idea of the whole to which they belong before we can say what those parts are. So it is a process that works in two directions. Anyway, the right hemisphere is better able to do that. It's better able to see something as quite individual and unique rather than just a member of a well-known category. It's better able to understand the implicit. And the implicit is not necessarily something we just haven't yet made explicit and could do in due course. The implicit may be something that actually depends on being implicit to have its meaning. And humor is a very good example. If you explain a joke, it's no longer funny. I realized this when I was studying literature, that if you explain a poem, you've got something else, but the poem itself is no longer moving, it no longer works on you. In fact, you're left with a handful of banalities, like when someone you love dies, it's hard. Yeah, I know that. But sometimes a poem can, on this topic, like Hardy's poems that he wrote on the death of his wife, they change your whole feeling about the world and life. They're extraordinary things. So it's better able to understand those things. It's better able to see that things that the left hemisphere thinks must exclude one another may both simultaneously be true. Now, this is so important, not just in art, but in our understanding of the world. A thing and what seems to be its opposite we may need both, and we may actually find that we can't have one without the other. But in the world in which we operate nowadays, too often positions are polarized to extremes in which we latch onto something that we think is good for some purpose, but don't realize that it has a shadow side to it. Working as a psychiatrist, that's been a very important part of my work, is helping people see that there are good sides to things they think are bad and bad sides to things that are good. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the right hemisphere is much better able to do this job. And it is the right hemisphere that underlies those aha moments, which are not just the kind of moments that artists, poets, and composers have, but they're the moments that the great mathematicians and physicists had when they made their insights. Often they worked away without any luck for a long period, and then when they were doing something completely else, going for a ride into the town to do shopping, the moment that they come home, they put their foot on the bus and the thing comes to them just like that. This moment, this aha moment, is almost inevitable in every great discovery. I don't know of any that weren't achieved with such a discovery. And it is dependent on the right superior temporal sulcus and gyrus and the right amygdala. So there's that. And I suppose what I really like in this book, and I hope you enjoy it in this chapter, I hope you enjoyed it, was that I look at pretty much all the examples I can come across of artists, composers, and poets who had a stroke in either the left or right hemisphere, and what happened to their work. And what seems to be quite clear is that a stroke in the left hemisphere doesn't necessarily damage their creativity at all. In fact, in some cases, it actually enhances or initiates the creativity, whereas if they have damage to the right hemisphere, their creativity is switched off. So, I mean, that's putting it rather crudely, but I hope I can at least interest people enough to take a look at it. I hope you'd find it rewarding. I mean, one of the nice things about the book is that there are a lot of illustrations. There's 100 or more illustrations, including many color plates. So you can see some of these paintings and drawings, and you can see it with your own eyes.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. We're going to move on to chapter 12, the signs of life, Ian. On the surface, the chapter came across as highly critical at the scientists. When you dive into the chapter, your main argument is that organism is not a machine. was your entire critique for the chapter. 70 pages here. It's really enlightening reading it. Can you speak a bit on that, please, Ian?
Yes, sure. One of the things I wouldn't want anyone to go away thinking from any type of acquaintance with my work is that I'm critical of science in the sense of diminishing its importance. I've spent decades in science myself, and I think it's of crucial importance, and people who dismiss it or neglect it are probably frightened of something or don't understand it. So that is not my point. My point is that sometimes it falls to the friend of somebody to be the person who points out where they're getting something wrong. And I see myself as the friend of science, but that to defend it from some of its more, shall I say, overweening, arrogant assumptions, that it can answer every kind of question. And also some of its assumptions of the model, because how we model something depends on what we find. This goes back to my point that how we attend to something changes what is there. I sometimes use the image of the mountain behind my house, which is called something which derives from a Norse word meaning the sloping rock, because when the Vikings came here 1,000 years ago, they could see this from the sea, and it protected them from having a shipwreck. So that was what this mountain meant for them. But it was also the home of the Picts, so they saw it as the home of the gods, they saw it as shelter. And then in the 18th century, it was a beautiful shape to draw and paint. In the 19th century, it was seen to be a spectacular example of columnar basalt formation. And now in modern physics, we can say, what is it? It's 99.99% space. And the other bit, we don't really know, honestly, what it is. So, which of these is the real mountain? The answer is that there is no one real mountain, but how you attend to something shows you something completely different. So the way we model living things reveals certain things. If we model them as machines, we will see only those aspects of them that look mechanical, and everything else will retreat, and we'll miss it. If we take a more rounded, holistic view of what is going on here, that it is a complex whole in which the parts are never just separate parts, but are differentiations of a whole that respond to the whole. We see it as something that has potential that is only now being realized in biology. It's a funny paradox that physics, the science of the inanimate, realized that you cannot banish consciousness from the physical world 100 years ago. But it's taken biology till now to shake off the mechanical view of the Victorian mindset. But anyway, we are now realizing that many things about living creatures, even the smallest and simplest organisms, absolutely do not fit with the picture of I would have to say Dawkins-like mechanism. And this is not a criticism in any way of, for example, Darwin. Darwin was a great genius, and he himself was extremely modest about what it was that he knew and what he'd found. This is not a repudiation of any sound science. It's a bit of a call to shake off the shackles of a mechanistic way of thinking and see the beauty, the wonder, the extraordinarily apt way in which living creatures cooperate, interact, and become more of what they are. So I hope it is a call to see something beautiful and true that corresponds to your experience. Whereas I think for many of us in the West, at any rate, from childhood, we've been taught to banish our immediate sense of the animate world and consider it as really a bunch of inanimate stuff.
It was one of my favorite chapters, Ian. You floor me, and I love that chapter 12, especially the culture sessions with AI and robot these days. What's your view on that, Ian?
On which?
On the AI obsessions, our culture obsessions with AI and computer and all these robots.
Yes, well, that's right. Well, I don't think I talk much about that actually in the book, although people may be interested to know that in November in Amsterdam I gave the opening address to the World Summit of AI, and And I use this lens of the left and right hemispheres to take a look at what it is that AI is already doing to our world, what it can achieve at best, and what it may worryingly achieve unless we're careful about how we apply it. After all, technology is only as good as the wisdom with which it is applied. It can be used for good or bad ends, and we need to be aware of that and not naively say, well, I'm just making stuff. It depends what you're doing, what you are contributing to the world. So I think it's important. But in the chapter on the science of life, chapter 12, I do refer to an enormous amount of literature. I think there are 5,600 papers referred to in the book. They're all referenced. That's why the bibliography is quite long. But I thought it very important that when I was putting forward a point of view that is not universally held within conventional mainstream science, although it's certainly been held for some time by some people that I consider inspirational scientists, you have to, dot your I's and cross your T's. I don't think anyone can say, well, there's no evidence.
Thank you. So we're going to move on. The last question I have is, you say relationship comes before relator. You say relationship precede things. Normally we would think that there are things which come first, then there are relationship between things. But you say there are relationship between the whole, i.e. the consciousness and matter, half created by our senses and half perceived, the influence of the whole. So Gestalt, you say it. It's so profound, Ian. I go around the room every Sunday reading Tao Te Ching on Clubhouse with Alice and a few others. So I'm comparing the two hemispheres with the Tao symbol of yin and yang, mythos and logos. It's beautiful. Yes. So I just wanted to briefly speak on the coincidence of the opposites.
Oh, wow. Well, we're in deep water there, aren't we? Again, if people are interested, I gave an hour-long talk to Royal College on this topic. But effectively, we come to this idea that was known to many cultures, including the pre-Platonic and particularly pre-Aristotelian Greek culture, and certainly to Indian and Chinese and Japanese culture, that things and their opposites coincide, and that this, and of course, it was importantly brought back into our culture by Jung, I think a very underrated thinker about the human condition. But it is important because, as I say, I think we misunderstand many things by having a simplistic, linear idea that things and their opposites are as far apart as they can get. And if we move away from something and keep on going, we'll get further and further away from what we're avoiding. Oddly enough, like Alice and Through the Looking Glass, we'll find ourselves confronting exactly the thing we were walking away from because opposites concur. In other words, things are not linear, but they are not either circular exactly, but spiral shaped. In other words, you don't come back, as T.S. Eliot said, to the place where you start and know it for the first time. You come back to a place on the spiral slightly above it, and you can look down on it and you can see its connection with where you are now. And perhaps through that, you can understand what it was you didn't see before. But I like the image of the spiral because if you think of a spiral, if you look right down it, it has this circular motion to it. If you look along the length of it, it has a wave-like motion. And I won't go into quite why those two kinds of motion are so important, but I have a whole chapter on flow, which is central to my ontology in the book. And of course, I do discuss, although I'm not a physicist, what we can glean from physics on these matters. I have, I might say, a team of what I call tame physicists who came out of the woodwork and wrote to me and said, your thesis is fascinating from our point of view. And so when I'm going to say something about physics, I always run it past them again, tell me I've completely got it wrong, but so I do test it out in that way. I think the question about the relationships coming before relato is an equally amazingly important concept. If I may just speak about it for a couple of minutes, which is almost impossible to do, but let me try. as I say, I think you can only know what you call a part by seeing the relationships in which it stands, and that everything that we see as a part is also a whole at another level. So you are always looking at nested wholes. You're not looking at anything that is just a fragment. There is no such thing, because everything that exists only in relation to everything else. So the net exists prior to the elements in the net that we look at and say, oh, there's something. It's a crossing point in the net. I like very much an image from the Vedic tradition, the Indian philosophical tradition, called Indra's net, of a net that is cast over the cosmos. And in that net, at every crossing point, there is a jewel. And in that jewel, every other jewel in the net is reflected. I think that actually is a very helpful and beautiful image. So I think this idea of relations being the most important thing also comes into two other chapters, which I can only hint at these now, otherwise we'll not have time for Q&A. But one is that I believe that ultimately, and I have another very long chapter on this, it's a short book length, on matter and consciousness and their relationship. And spoiler alert, I believe that consciousness is an ontological primitive. In other words, it doesn't arise from anything else. It is actually a primary constituent. And I'm not saying it necessarily is prior to matter, because I hold that matter is a different phase of consciousness, in the same way that ice is a different phase from water, and steam is a different phase from water, and they have quite different qualities. One of them flows, one of them is solid, one of them is invisible. What is all this? Can they be the same? Well, they can actually. And I see matter as the element in consciousness that provides necessary resistance, coming back to the idea of opposites creating one another, and a degree of permanence that is greater than simply an idea on its own. And it also connects. So consciousness, what is consciousness? Consciousness is always a relation. It's directed towards something. There must be, in this process, more than one element, even if those elements can be subsumed in the same thing at a higher level. So in my consciousness, there is me and there is something I'm conscious of. My consciousness is always disposed towards something. That doesn't exclude that, as I say, at a higher level, one may say that all consciousness is one. I don't want to go into that now. But what I'm saying is that consciousness is directed. It has an object. It's the I-thou relationship, which is so important in humanity. And the other thing is to say that in the realm of the sacred, in most traditions from Buddhism to Christianity, whatever it is that we mean by the founding principle, the God, the divine in the cosmos, is equated with love. And love is nothing if it's not a relationship. That's exactly what love is. So I could talk for much longer, but I suspect you want me to be brief. So.
No, it's beautiful, Ian. And I'm going to warn you that you have a massive fan base on Clubhouse, and quite a few of them on this stage with us today. So I'm going to pass the mic to Prakash.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful exploration of the mind and the matter with things, and the whole interconnection of matter and consciousness. Thank you very much, Ian. My question is quite direct. What are the tools? We hear about meditation, mindfulness, and other things, to balance the right and the left. What would you, from your own experience in psychiatry, listening to people talking about these things, what are some of the things that you would recommend that people opt as a daily activity? Thank you.
It's a good question. Very good question. And of course, there's a tendency to say, well, as long as you do the following things, you'll be all right. It would be rather like if somebody asked a Buddhist, experienced Buddhist monk, what do I have to do to become a Buddhist? And he said, well, don't eat meat and sit cross-legged on the floor for 15 minutes in the morning and so on. But that isn't actually becoming a Buddhist. So, but nonetheless, there are things that would help towards enlarging the scope of, or bringing into our lives a greater awareness of what our right hemisphere can tell us. I think one is silence and attention to what is, in other words, to mindfulness. I think mindfulness is an important practice, and it's a simple enough practice that it could be taught in school so that everybody knows something about it and how to recapture their constantly being fragmented and grabbed attention. I think switching off from social media for the majority of the day, if not altogether, is a good thing. I know that social media has its advantages, and probably to some extent I benefit from that, because I have a very kind PA who I never go on social media, but who puts up things. And so I may be hypocritical here, but I don't want to be involved with it. I find that a lot of what goes on there is not very enlightening, and that it fragments your attention and diverts you from the deep things which often take consistent, calm, deep thought. I think listening to music is important, reading poetry. I think that there are certain kinds of other forms of art, film and plays that are helpful. I think this is not to disrespect other aspects of our intellectual life, but to talk about the things that tend to get driven out by our everyday lives at the moment. I think that being in nature is important. I think cultivating a spiritual allegiance is important. This may or may not be to an existing religion, although it would be wise not to dismiss a religious base based on most probably thousands of years of human experience, which is not to say that you should be uncritical, but I think one can also be arrogant in one's unwillingness to learn. I think that, yes, practicing gratitude and a degree of humility are good. I don't want to sound pompous, and I don't want to say I'm good at them, but I do try to incorporate them into my daily life. And I think they make life better and happier and richer. So I think these are all the sorts of things that are not often obvious from the way we lead our lives every day, but could be. That's not supposed to be exhaustive. It's just a few hints, really. Sorry, it sounds very banal, but I hope it's all right.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Prakash. And we move over to Ari, please.
Hey, Ian. Hey, everyone. So, one of the questions I have is about, we also had Mark Soames as one of our speakers, and he talked about the fundamental basis of consciousness arising from the stem cells of the brain, which is a very primitive reptilian sort of part of the brain from where the primitive consciousness emerges. That's what he
the brain stem. Yes.
Yeah. So with regards to, and with that, he was also, talking about dualistic monism as a key idea to understand philosophically what consciousness is. So, he was coming from these two sides of things to understand consciousness. How do you see, in your understanding, that sort of, that sort of view that Mark Soames had, and because you have a more, I understood is more view based on workings of her right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain, and
well,
like, what do you want to how do you see that view with your understanding of things?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think myself that dual aspect monism is in a way what I was describing 10 minutes ago, that it is likely, it seems to me, that there is not, as it were, a great cleft between matter and consciousness, but matter is a way in which consciousness manifests at times. And so, in other words, it does have different aspects, and it may have more than those two aspects. In fact, I believe that value is another aspect of consciousness. So dual or even multi-aspect monism is, I think, a very important idea. I would agree with Mark Soames on that. I haven't read his work, I have to say, but I may be wrong, but I believe that he is of the view that consciousness arises out of the brainstem, and particularly, I think, the reticular activating system. It's certainly true that it is extremely important, has been known for a very, very long time to be very important for the maintenance of consciousness as we know it, so that in a human being, somebody who has damaged the reticular activating system may lose consciousness. That is certainly true. But I think that's different from the claim, which you may have very good reasons for holding onto, that it actually originates consciousness. And as I say, I can't dispute what he says because I haven't read it. But what I have concluded from my own reading, thinking, pondering over a professional lifetime is that consciousness cannot be said to emerge from anything else, that it is, as I say, an ontological primitive. And that is not an uncommon view these days among both philosophers and psychologists. And of course, it accords with all that we know from the ancient wisdom traditions of the world, which is very nice. And I think, from my understanding of modern physics, that most of the great physicists of the last century, at any rate, the people who changed our understanding of modern physics and gave rise to quantum theory, including especially quantum field theory, which I'm myself most interested in, took the view that consciousness was, as I say, an ontological primitive that was important for the understanding of all that exists. So that would be my position.
Thank you so much, Ian. So I guess it's interesting. So throughout my development years, came across different information like type A personality, type B personality. Did come across the left brain, right brain idea, and but then I was starting to read some work of Carl Gustav Jung, and so I focused on the thinking and the feeling aspect. Because I was very much focused on love and how to become the most loving possible, and I noticed that thinking was getting in the way at times, and feeling wasn't prominent enough. So I focused on the balance between thinking and feeling, and I really love how you focused on the right hemisphere and kind of flipped the narrative to show that the right hemisphere is the master, because when it comes to love, that feeling, that attention aspect to it is super important. And a lot of people, and myself included, when I was in a realm of thinking too much, I wasn't really able to feel and love as best as possible. So that also leads me to something that you kind of touched upon when you mentioned the shadow. But I was wondering, maybe the shadow self kind of ties into this as well. Perhaps you could talk about Carl Gustav Jung, the thinking and feeling, and the shadow self.
Yes, well, quite a lot there. I mean, of course, the first thing I have to say whenever I talk about this is put out of your mind everything that you thought you knew about the topic of left hemisphere and right hemisphere differences, because it's all, with, as I say, tiny exceptions, mistaken. Which is not to disrespect people who did the best they could at the time, but science progresses and science replaces previous beliefs, and we now know more, which is great. Part of that is that I wouldn't necessarily, I know why you say this, but I wouldn't necessarily want to have a divide between the hemispheres on the basis of thinking and feeling. I think that the deeper feelings, rather than the social expression of certain kinds of affect, is more heavily dependent on the right hemisphere than the left. It's clearly demonstrable that the right hemisphere has better emotional and social intelligence. In other words, understanding what's going on between people and in emotional life than the left. But it is also, interestingly, more important for cognition, for thinking, which is not to say that the left hemisphere doesn't. It obviously does contribute a great deal in terms of analysis. But actually, when you look at people who've had brain damage and have a drop in IQ, and a study of about 150 such people showed extraordinary consistency, that where the IQ had dropped after a stroke, the stroke was almost always in the right hemisphere, not the left. So it is fascinating that it is the center of both a higher understanding intellectually and emotionally. And I think that it also understands symbolic meaning, metaphorical meaning, better than the left hemisphere. Well, there's no question. It's not just something I think. There's a massive evidence on that subject. And as you know, that was something that was very important to Jung. He thought that we understood the world through symbols, not symbols in a one-to-one decoding sense, like a stoplight shows red, which means stop, but more the sense of the deep meaning of a metaphor, like the idea of a rose as something that can draw blood, but is also the color of blood, is also the meaning of love, and is, a growing thing, and it has a wonderful scent. All these ideas that are there in it. So symbols are very important for Jung. And I think that he, in fact, invented a term, enantiodroma, which means, you may know this, which means roads going in opposite directions. And of course, what Heraclitus, one of my philosophical heroes, said was that the road up is the road down. By which, of course, he meant that the same road that can take you up is also the road that can take you down. It depends how you're looking at something. And so this concept of enantiodroma was important for the understanding of the human psyche, that opposites had to be seen together. And I was just saying, I'm not a Jungian, I'm not trained as a Jungian. I have a great admiration for what I've read of Jung. But a lot of my experience was getting people who thought they were being enormously kind and good to see that actually what they were doing by their kindness and goodness was in some ways tyrannical and controlling for others. It's a painful thing to show people, but sometimes you have to, with all kindness, try and get them to a point where they can see that. Or that where people were blaming themselves terribly for having certain sinful deficiencies and so on, these were honest acceptances of something that also had a redemptive side to it. So I think, a lot of our work in life is helping people to see that there is good where they thought there wasn't, and to see that there may be harm that they need to be aware of where they thought there was only good. In fact, if we could import that into many of the rather simple-minded wars on social media, we might actually improve the quality of human intercourse and produce a happier world.
That was amazing. The reason why I asked is because, I feel like you have transcended the work of Jung in the time that we're in, and others have tried. I won't name any names. I know you've had an interview with him before, but the thing is that I believe that you're resemblant of the Carl Gustav Jung of our time. And I just wanted to say, I think you've built on what I used to know, and I appreciate all of the work, time, energy that you put into the two books you wrote, or the two that I've had the opportunity of knowing about.
Those are lovely words. Thank you very much indeed. I wish I could live up to them, but I'm very grateful for their expression.
Yes, you did. You do. You're a hero here. And we're going to go on to Willi.
Yeah, hi. Fantastic to have you here, Dr. McGilchrist. It's such an honor. And I think your thinking is a great answer to the challenges of our time right now. And I will ask you about two challenges. But first, to have a context about me, I am doing foresight since 1995. And this is future studies, scenario planning, and so on. But I myself see me as a post-futurist because I don't subscribe to the camp of the belief of the messiah of technocracy. Yeah, you see, I feel in the same camp in a way because you think we have to understand our paradigm and then to have a kind of counter paradigm, if I get it right. And most of my futurist colleagues are technocrats, to be very clear about this. And I don't want to be in this camp. And here, to bring you into the context of how to the point you are, paradoxically, I bring you a quote from a man who is like-minded, just a short quote, which was translated automatically. Sorry, I had no time to do it by myself. It's a short quote, and it's so stunning. And just as a quiz, asking you whether you might guess who it is. Just this quote starts: "We should finally stop mixing what is deeply divided, the powers of life and the soul, with those of reason and will. We should realize that it is part of the essence of the rational will to tear the wheel of Maya to shreds, and that a humanity that has given itself over to such will must, in blind rage, devastate its own mother, the earth, until all life and finally itself is handed over to nothingness. No teaching can bring back what has been lost. Only an inner change of life, which is not within the power of man, can help us to turn back." Have any idea who was it? It's 110 years old. 110 years old. It's
110 years old.
It's Ludwig Klages in Man and Earth. Yeah. And he is seen, despite all the differences with you, you are unique, of course. And so he has some strange spots on his clothes for me. Anyway, he was kind of a forerunner or a thought leader 110 years ago of deep ecology, so to speak. And this is the first challenge of our time, the destruction of the biosphere. The planet cannot be destructed, but the biosphere can be transformed to our disadvantage. And he was very clairvoyant. And today, now here's the second challenge. The first one was ecology or the global crisis. And the second is AI. And I see 2022 and 2023 as kind of time of transformation, so to speak. And I just today read that now some researchers explicitly want to go from artificial intelligence to artificial consciousness. And so my question here is this the triumph of this narrow rationality, so to speak, with Adorno, Horkheimer, and the Frankfurt School, because they thought it's just narrow rationality, which is our original sin? And is this the right diagnosis, or what do you bring on the table here that you can give us hope that we can change all the three layers: micro, our individual self, meso, our community around us, and macro, global politics, global thought leaders, all the global institutions, which are still, of course, totally in the other paradigm. And this is my question.
Well,
how can we do it? Thank you.
Yes. Well, I don't think I've got very much time left to answer these questions. So they're very, very big ones. And like you, I think that the destruction of the biosphere and the degradation of humanity through hybridization with AI are two of the greatest threats. Indeed, the effects of increasing technological displacement of the human and degradation of the human in daily life are the two great threats. I see this as not so much to do with the rational mind, because I think that it is profoundly irrational. It's very narrow-minded and foolish. I think it's a product of a very simplistic, narrow view of what a human being is, what the world is, and it's not rational enough. So it's based on pseudo-philosophy, this mechanistic idea that we are just mechanisms, machines, whereas in fact our consciousness is embodied, our bodies, our emotions, our soul, may I dare to say it, are also parts of this. And with Hannah Arendt, I think that what is probably the essence of what she called evil is this reduction of mankind to zombies, to robots, to machines. I'm very troubled by it. I recently had a conversation with somebody that you probably all know, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he impressed on me that he thinks that simple desire for self-preservation, in other words, a rational view of what one is doing, will eventually prevail and cause governments to rein back their programs for giving more and more power to machine thinking and machine learning. I would love to think that he's right, and I enjoy his optimism. I call myself a hopeful pessimist, by which I mean when I look around, I don't like the look of what's there, but I have hope that what comes can never be foreseen. There were times in history when people must have thought, well, it's all up with Western civilization, but it actually wasn't. So I don't know, really, is the answer. Crystal ball failure, but I'm hoping that we can, people of goodwill and people of imagination can work together to go beyond this terribly restricted image of, Kurzweil and Harari and people who welcome this appalling vision of humanity sort of hybridized with machines. Anyway, there we are. That's all I can say in a short space. I say more, but not very much more in the 25-minute talk I did for the World Summit of AI. But there we are. Thank you.
Great. That was amazing. Just a little question afterwards, because some years ago...
Well, I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. Is that fair? I mean, is there anyone else who wants to answer a question? Or have we run out of time, indeed, Ivy? I don't know.
Yeah.
You're right.
We have 30 more minutes. Ian.
Oh, we do? Oh, okay. That's fine.
Yes, we have 30 more minutes, Ian. Did you want to
that's fine.
Willi again?
Yes, go on. Ask your other point. Yes.
Yeah, cool. Because you talked about spirals, and some years ago I was rather inspired by a grand narrative of starting with Graves back and others, the spiral dynamics view of the whole history. And by the way, funny fact, the great work of Klages was also 1,500 or 1,600 pages. And Graves is controversial. And like you, for most of our mediocre scientists, much too bulky. So they cannot digest if someone wants to have a great view on all history and mankind and multidisciplinary and so on. I think you also experience it. And what I want to ask is, they used it as a diagnostic tool, just asking whether you anyhow know it, because I understand if if people ignore it because it's not so good validated in science, spiral dynamics, and all this community around it. They are different. It's not only one. Do you know them? Just first question.
Sorry, do I know who?
It's a community around the world for years, and it started with Graves, like with a V, and it's long ago. He had a great vision about the cultural evolution of humanity, and it's in spirals. It's very dialectic and inspired by Hegel, whatever, and it's not so good validated. I only want to say that I would understand if you ignore it, even if you met them, because many scientists just say it's too big to digest.
Well, no, I haven't. But I mean, what I believe about the spiral is something that, in a way, is an intuitive belief that has emerged out of many different paths that I've pursued, because I've got a bit of a checkered history, but out of those comes the sort of feeling there's something very important about the spiral, which is that it's not discontinuous in the way that dialectic sometimes seems to be, in which there's a sort of ping pong backwards and forwards between two opposites, but that actually these two opposites are in some kind of linear progress, but that it is not summable up as a linear progress, because it also incorporates this circular motion in which things are always coming back and revisiting their origins. So I think it's a deep one. I think it's there in essence in a number of different people who've intuited something of the kind. Some of them artists and poets like Blake. I've taken as my image for my channel McGilchrist, where people can go if they want to find out more about my work. But I've taken the image of Blake's painting of Jacob's Ladder, and it's the only instance I know of the portrayal of Jacob's Ladder as not a straight ladder, but as of a spiral. And he was such an extraordinarily deeply intuitive man. I'm sure that he was sensing something important there, that the process is never a straight one. And in the book, I also quote from the marvelous Austrian painter and architect Friedensreich Hundertwasser, his belief that die gerade Linie, the straight line, was the downfall of mankind. And there's something wrong with this, that we're in love with the straight line. So there we are. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we move on to Alice?
Yes. Thank you, Ivy. Thank you, Ian. I've been hosting a reading and discussion of Tao Te Ching with Ivy and many other friends here in Clubhouse. So I'm especially interested in chapter 20, and I became very excited to ask you this question. In chapter 20, you have argued that at the origin of everything, there lies a coincidence of opposites that is profoundly generative, necessary for creation, and that this coincidence of opposites is by no means contrary to reason. So my question is, can duality and non-duality coexist as such a coincidence of opposites? And does it violate the law of non-contradiction in logic?
Very, very good. It probably might, but then you see, I think that one of the useful but dangerous, because limiting steps in the history of Western philosophy was Aristotle's elevation of the law of non-contradiction, and I think that it's got much to answer for. So I think it's perfectly coherent to say, which I sometimes do, that we need not just an either or in our searching for truth, but a both and. But we need not the both and to replace the either or simply, but to complement the either or. So we need not either or both and, but both either or and both and. So that addresses immediately this idea of the complementary structure of these two ways of thinking of things. Now, whether that's equivalent to non-duality and duality depends on how one defines non-duality. Some people define non-duality as already including a taking up of the idea of duality. But if you define it as an abolition of duality, then we would need to reintegrate duality with non-duality. And so I sometimes say we need not the duality of duality and non-duality, but the non-duality of duality and non-duality. In other words, we need that at a higher level, at a meta level, always to be including the things that seem opposites. Now, interestingly, this is also an image of how the hemispheres work, as you may possibly know, because you've obviously read a long way into my book. The right hemisphere sees the need for both the right and the left hemisphere. In fact, in the story of the master and his emissary, the master, the right hemisphere, delegated work to the left hemisphere to do on its behalf so that it could maintain a certain overview which would otherwise be lost. So it sees the need for both and, but the left hemisphere thinks that there are simply facts that are right or wrong, and that what it sees is all that there is. So it's in the terms of Donald Rumsfeld, it knows perhaps its known unknowns, but it doesn't know its unknown unknowns, and that's when the real devil gets into things and causes trouble, when people are not aware of their unknown unknowns. So the right hemisphere has this inclusive take on the relationship, and the left hemisphere this competitive or diverse relationship. And this is explored by neuropsychologists, the way in which the two relate, and the more inclusive attitude of the right hemisphere, the more willingly cooperative attitude of the right hemisphere, and the more defiant attitude, if you like, or neglectful or restricted attitude of the left hemisphere. And people may say, oh, well, you're personifying the hemispheres. Well, it's impossible to talk about aspects of what is, after all, human experience without using some model. And one model might be a computer, but another model might be, it's like people, because after all, the brain is more like people than it is like, it's more like the human mind than it's like a computer. So I'm sorry, you have to live with that limitation of the ways in which we can talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
And yeah, thank you. Well, next guest is Victoria.
Thank you, Ivy. Thank you, Dr. McGilchrist, for joining us today. I did have a question, and it related primarily to the neuroscience section of your book. Can you speak to the difficulty in gleaning insights from research studies related to the brain? And specifically, as an example, in chapter 8, you talk about creativity, and at the very end of that chapter, about the correlation between intelligence and mood disorders, and the fact that there are contradictory studies out there.
Yes. Well, when you're dealing with anything as complex as the human mind, which after all contains everything we know, you're not going to get nice clear-cut answers to questions. So what one's always doing is having to assess quite a bit of evidence on its merits. And it's inevitable that in the life sciences, there will never be just one story. That would be improbable. Even in physics, there is not just one story. It depends which physicist you're talking to. So there is always this problem, but I think there are very consistent themes. And what I would say is that we need to bring together as much evidence as we can to bear on any of these questions. So what I like to do is to try to take a very broad vision of any particular question about hemisphere difference and look at it using a number of different tools. For example, rather neglected these days, but I think extremely important, is the literature on brain insults, brain injuries, and the effects that they immediately have on the mental world of the sufferer. That's important. I think that studies using EEG are very important because they can pinpoint very narrow time bands. They can pinpoint moments in a process. And then, of course, there are what most people think of as neuroimaging, i.e. fMRI and MRI, structural MRI, the information that gives us. And then, of course, there are other things like ERP studies, which are just really a shoot of electroencephalography. So all these things. And then stories, human stories, narratives of individuals about their experience after having a stroke or suffering a tumor and so on. These things are incredibly important and rich. And what I absolutely was blown away by was the extent of a very great treasure house of information about this, developed by extremely thorough, scholarly writers, usually German or French, in the first part of the 20th century and the very last decade of the 19th century, when it was common to do very, very detailed examinations of individuals with brain lesions. And so they might report 30 pages of a report on this patient, including many aspects, all the neurological objective findings, the kind of way in which the person talks and the ideas they had and so on. Now, this is absolute gold dust to someone who's trying to understand how the brain and the human mind work. And so I was, delighted to be able to bring quite a lot of that to bear on it. And some of it hasn't been translated, but I've offered translations, including the original, so where I've got it wrong, people can find that. So my message really is, it's a very difficult thing to do, but it's not impossible. And you can find very strong strands that can't be ignored, that are quite coherent. Overall, what I value is the sense that I've gleaned a coherent picture, which doesn't really contradict any of the important things that people working in other areas of neuroscience have found from their examinations of individuals. And I wish we could actually re-import a more phenomenological element into our practice of neuroscience. I think some people do that, of course, but not widely enough, perhaps.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. McGilchrist. That's so great to have you here. I think you're doing just fantastic work, very important work, actually, for a number of reasons. I wanted to, since you shared this bit about Jacob's ladder, I just brought something which I want to share, and then I have a question. But this is something very fascinating, I think, because I was just seeing the Blake's paintings of Jacob's ladder. And I've been also reading this book called The Cosmic Serpent. It's very interesting because if you look at Jacob's ladder, that spiral thing, you see the similarities with the structure of DNA.
Exactly.
And The Cosmic Serpent, I don't know if you've heard about that book or read it.
I haven't, but I know about it. Yeah.
Okay, so it's about drawing parallels between the structure of DNA and certain experiences that shamans in South America have when they see snakes, and like even the caduceus symbol, the medical symbol. Exactly. You can see the striking similarities there. It's pretty phenomenal, and it also brings to me the game. There's an ancient game which actually was, I think, started in India, called Snakes and Ladders, which many people are familiar with. And apparently that it also comes from this, is inspired by this. So it's fantastic how things are connected at this microcosmic and macrocosmic level. But my question was, since now, being a psychiatrist, you're a philosopher, you've done extensive studies into this, and people have spoken about Jung here. Considering the state of mental health in the world today, what, in terms of psychological treatment and counseling and stuff like that, what have you, is there something where you would say that a newer, novel approach where, do you consider Freudian psychoanalysis, for instance, or Jungian analytical psychology, or do you think that there must be a more comprehensive sort of another approach to this whole thing of psychological sort of wholeness and well-being, and for people to unearth their complexes and all those things that Freud started talking about and Jung then developed further. So I'm just trying to see what insights you might have got on that.
Well, yes. First of all, it is, as you say, extraordinary that for 2,000 years or more, there's been an image of the caduceus, of this wand that has this coiled serpents around it, imaging the structure of DNA. But when it comes to your question about treatments, well, you would probably expect me to be rather holistic in my approach. So what I think is there is no one way of treating patients. Obviously in the sense that they're all different, you need to know what is going to work for this person. And actually, I feel that my skill, if I had one as a consultant psychiatrist, was being able to see what the right path for this particular person was. And in doing so, one needs to draw on a large range of things. So in the genesis of a condition, there are going to be elements that are genetic. There are going to be elements to do with early life. There are going to be life events. There's going to be sociological pressures. There's going to be personality elements. There's going to be many different factors, and different conditions require different approaches. So although it might sound reductionist, it isn't at all to say that for a lot of people, medication is terribly important. I have seen the miracle of medication so many thousands upon thousands of times in my career, and I've also experienced it in my own life, to know that it is very important. But it's not usually the whole story. There are usually other things that need to be addressed, and particularly in the case of depression, and even more in the case of personality problems. We're looking at therapies that can be helpful, both short-term cognitive therapy, cognitive analytic therapy, and for some people, a long course of psychodynamic psychotherapy, either Freudian or Jungian. I myself incline towards the Jungian picture more. But I think these things are not a one-size-fits-all, and I think that it would be easy to overemphasize the importance of psychodynamic psychotherapy, as it's easy to overemphasize the importance of medicine. But each of these is important and can be crucial in its own terms at its own time for the right person. So I would see a broad picture there. One thing I can say is that I think that science, the science of medicine, needs also to remember that it is humane. It is a humanity. Medicine is as much an art as it is a science. And I fear that that may be getting lost in the idea that it's all to do with information processing that can be done by a computer. The relationship between a doctor and a patient is absolutely core to that patient's recovery and to that patient's flourishing. And the loss of a more rounded, integral vision of what the human being is and what the relationship between the doctor and the patient is, that the loss of that or the erosion of that, because it's not completely lost, is something that needs to be guarded against.
Thank you for that.
Thanks, doctor. I am finding that a lot of people are suffering from the stroke these days. Maybe because of vaccine, we don't really know that part. But is there any kind of methodology or some kind of new methodology which is emerging out of the research that you're doing? I've not read the book, so I cannot really know that. But I was just very curious, particularly because I read about this Michael Levin's work with bioelectric fields and how they control the way the expansion of the body happens from one cell, like how the multicellular system comes into being with all the morphology in place and things like that. So I just wanted to know whether there's anything that's happening in that.
Well, as you know, as far as I understand your question, there are now improvements in the ways in which we can respond, particularly if we can intervene early in the history of an evolving stroke. But again, strokes are difficult to generalize about because depending very much on where they are, their nature and their extent, certain techniques are more valuable or less valuable. I'd also say that this is nothing that I am really at the moment a good person to ask about, because it's something like 12 years now, or certainly 11 years since I was involved in clinical practice. I had to make a decision actually after The Master and His Emissary seemed to be being widely read, to carry on doing my clinical work or to stop and do things like write another book, which I did. So I'm probably not the authority that you would like me to be on the treatment of such strokes these days, but certainly we are making strides there and things are becoming better.
Can we move on to Luca?
Hi, this is Luca down here at the bottom. I had the question. You've spoken, you've mentioned a couple of times different artists and poets, Blake among them. And I'm quite interested in art and how we interface with art and all its forms, visual art, poetry, literature, music, dance. And I'm curious, you've led a rather interesting life, both professionally and I would imagine you've had some interesting adventures along the way. And I'm curious if your life, I'm very curious about art, engaging in art and the sublime, the awe-inspiring, something that sort of transcends the human experience, the sense of discreteness and being apart from everything and being swept up into something grander, especially through art. And I'm curious if your life has given you any, just anything you'd like to share about that.
Well, thank you. I mean, the part played in my life by particularly poetry and music has been very great. Really from early childhood, poetry seemed to me a rather extraordinary thing. It took me a while to get away from the kind of music that people were trying to interest me in. It was only really when I first heard Bach, Mozart's chamber music and Beethoven's late piano sonatas that I really realized how unbelievably powerful music was. But from an early age, I found magic in words, including in German words. My father, when I was about 4 or 5, I remember him reciting. He wasn't a man who was very interested in poetry, but he had to learn at school a poem by Heinrich Heine, the German romantic poet, Die Lorelei. And when I listening to it, I was thinking, "Whoa, this is so rich." In fact, I thought the words were more real than any English word. So I've always had this feeling like, Sonnenschein seemed to me much more the word for sunshine than sunshine. Sunshine seemed a rather pedestrian, flabby word compared with Sonnenschein. But anyway, that's just a by the by. But so those things have always played a huge part in my life. And during the first year of lockdown, I don't know why I had this idea, but I just had this idea that to communicate more, I would read poetry, not my own, but, poems that I had liked and valued. So on my channel, I have something called a YouTube channel. It's not the same as Channel McGilchrist, but anyway, on it there are a lot of, I think 365 readings of poetry by me, because I tried to do one every day. So if you're interested, please go there.
Yes, we loved it. We love it. Continue. We check it every week.
Oh, good. Okay.
And we love it so much. So we got Victoria, our last guest. I'm just going to inform you, we have about 161 people been to the room. And then we have so far about 55 people in the room listening to you today. So it's almost about 161. So our last question, we're going to give it to Victoria.
Actually, I would like to show some appreciation. I come as an anecdote. I was diagnosed with chronic complex severe PTSD with dissociation, and later on bipolar disorder. Expert methods found my conditions to be 100% total, complete and permanent. I believed them until I stopped. And then now there's a journey in between this point and that point, but now it's easier for me to conceptualize this experiences as perceiving how light interacts with material within a box. And your work kind of frames that away for me to where it's not necessarily an anecdote, but I just wanted to show you great appreciation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very, very nice. Thank you very much. I don't know that I've quite caught your image, but it sounded very interesting. Yeah.
So I have a last question for you, Ian. So what is your hope for the future scientist then?
The hope for the future
scientist.
So hope for the future scientist, yes. Interestingly, that was a topic of a PARI lecture that I gave, but or discussion at any rate. But yes, I think there is great hope for science. As I say again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm critical of science, good science of itself, for good reason. It's just that when people simplistically think that science and reason can answer all our questions, they're making a mistake. So I think we need more imagination. We need things to be freed up so that research is not only done by very large groups with very expensive machines, because this tends to result in conformity, both in careers and in the kind of results that are produced. Many of the great breakthroughs of the middle of the last century were made by individuals who were given a budget, not an enormous one, but for example, at the Rand Corporation were given a room and a desk and some money and told, get on with it, do what you want. And actually, I was the beneficiary of this in my own life, in that I got a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, at the age of 21. And that gave me 7 years. And they said, no, we don't want to pin you down to doing a doctorate or anything like that. We want you to explore whatever is of interest to you. And that, I believe, set the path for me to be interested in a lot of things. And it's by drawing them together that I think that the breakthroughs will be made. When you look at the history of science and maths and so on, these are people whose minds range widely generally. And I think that, if we could encourage that through education and encourage that through the way we set up research, and not narrow people to, nowadays you often have to say in the research proposal what it is you're going to find and why that's going to be important. That's the death of the life of the mind.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Can we all give a massive thank you to Dr. Iain McGilchrist for his time today? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
Very
you.
kind.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thanks. Thank you very much.